Welcome, welcome, everyone. Thank you for listening today and welcome to the show, Kim. I'm so happy you are here.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and we have a lot to talk about today. I have so many questions for you, but before we get into all things vaginas, tell us a little bit about your story, who you serve, and how you came to be the vagina coach.
Yeah, I really it started back in grade 6. I remember seeing a childbirth video as part of our sex education, and it
Does
made.
do you think everyone still does that? Is that
I actually don't know. My kids did not see a childbirth video in their sex ed. I know that.
okay?
Um, yeah, so I don't know. I saw it, and anyway, I went home and I remember looking at my mom thinking, well, she did it and she's okay. And, all these other women in my life, but I definitely, it planted a seed thinking I'm not doing that. And so my, growing up years, nope, not doing it. However, I was curious. And so I was like, well, what was your birth like, mom? And so she was very open in sharing information with my brother and I. And she told me about episiotomies that she had. She had, and as I got older, when she was older, she had surgery for incontinence. She had chronic back pain. She had a tummy that wouldn't flatten. She had heavy bleeding, which she had a hysterectomy for. And so I sort of had this picture of pregnancy and childbirth as not something that I really want to participate in. But I got married. I decided I did want to start a family. And so I was determined to have a different story than my mom. I had looked at elective cesarean. I did a lot of research on that and started researching the pelvic floor and tearing and all that sort of stuff. And my midwives had recommended a product to me called the Epino, which is a biofeedback device made in Germany. And I purchased one and I had a great experience. I certainly credit the fact that my midwives were amazing. I was in a side lying birth position, which I know is protective of the pelvic floor. But it was something I just thought, like, how can the rest of the world not know about this? And so I contacted the company and said, hey, could I be a distributor? And that's kind of how it started. And it wasn't supposed to be a business per se. I just thought it would be a little side hustle. And in 2009, I was laid off from my corporate job. So I had been in fitness for a number of years and I got out of it and I was working in human resources. And I lost my job in 2009. And I thought, okay, well, here we go. And I already had a website, but now I was out busy trying to promote it. We had Twitter at the time, that was it. And I started networking with other people and met two other women who were in a similar realm. One was a pelvic health physio, another was a personal trainer like myself. And we formed a second business called Bellies Inc. And our intention was to optimize postpartum recovery. And we we manufactured a postpartum recovery garment and exercise program. We then created certification programs. And so I juggled the two businesses for a number of years. And in 2019, I bought my partners out, was in the process of amalgamating Bellies Inc. into my own business, ended up selling the product side of that. And now I'm back to where I started, except I don't have an e-commerce store per se. It's online programs and coaching. And the vagina coach part came about 4 or 5 years ago. I was speaking at a conference for mompreneurs. It was the National Mompreneur Conference in Toronto. And my talk was how optimizing your pelvic health can make you a better mompreneur. And all these speakers were some sort of a business coach. And when it was my time to come and speak, I got up on stage and made a joke that, now you have a vagina coach for your business. And it was just a joke. It kind of just came out on a whim, but it was a bit of a light bulb moment. And up to that point, I had been known as the fitness doula because I focused primarily on pregnant women and people. And because now I was evolving through the different life stages, the doula portion didn't necessarily resonate anymore. So Vagina Coach summed it up, and that's how it started.
That's amazing. So that's a lot of different business ventures, but all with the same background, right? Just kind of
Yes.
helping women have better pregnancies and post pregnancy journeys, right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Very cool. And I think your business now has like the best tagline ever of every vagina needs a coach.
Yeah.
When I read that when I was looking at your website and everything, I was like, wow, that's brilliant. But what motivated that saying? Like, why do you believe that every vagina does need a coach?
After I started my first business where I was selling that initial product, I added more products. So I became a bit of a destination for pelvic health products, specifically in Canada and where I'm from. And I started to have people, I had a little box saying, how did you hear about us when they made a purchase? And many people would say my pelvic floor physiotherapist. And I had never heard of a pelvic floor physiotherapist at this time. This was back in 2009. And so I started to Google pelvic floor physiotherapy and found a few that were in my neck of the woods. And I reached out to them. And it turned out a few of them were the ones who were referring people to me. So it was a nice opportunity for us to connect. But I remember going and sitting down with them and saying, what do you do? I've never heard of you. How are you helping people? And I came out of that appointment with, kind of this like, and I still do it. I preach ad nauseum that pelvic floor physio is the most underused women's health resource that we have. And so that's kind of how it started. And then out of that just sort of stemmed the need for more information than what is currently delivered to people. I saw my mom suffer for many, many years. I started reading statistics on people, how long they were waiting. First line of defense was always the doctor. Then they would be put down kind of the medical route, which is typically medications or surgery, which we need sometimes and super grateful we have them. However, not everybody needs them. And I think a lot of people end up down that route. I think my mom included, where they could have, had they had other options given to them, could have maybe avoided that. And so the coach piece, like the fitness piece, came where I recognized the benefit of pelvic floor physio coming from a fitness background myself, and everything I was learning about the pelvic floor and the abdominal wall, diastasis recti, incontinence, organ prolapse, all this stuff, and the rates of it. And then working in the fitness industry and knowing that a huge number of clients and participants in fitness classes are struggling with these issues and suffering in silence and not telling their trainers and not telling anybody. And I would start to watch the people who would be, especially women, peeing before every exercise class, leaving halfway through and then coming back, avoiding certain exercises. And so I started to see that link there and said, well, we need this conversation to be started in the fitness industry. And so that when we started Bellies Inc. and created our certification, that's what we were trying to do, was to get this into personal trainers and fitness professionals who are in the perfect position to help screen for and refer on to pelvic floor physio. So our intention was really to create information and awareness and normalize the conversation, but also create a relationship between personal trainers or fitness professionals and pelvic health physios, because it's a perfect marriage. And when you have the fitness aspect built into pelvic floor, it's no longer this conversation of go home and do your Kegels, which nobody does. And when you can incorporate it into a whole body movement, it's part of our core. So our core exercise is now more robust. Our capacity for movement and endurance and strength is improved in many cases. And so it was just a natural fit. And so the coach piece kind of came, I had never called myself a coach before. I was always, I'm a pelvic floor personal trainer is what I used to say. But, I wasn't necessarily standing next to people saying, okay, do 3 sets of 10-second hold Kegel exercises. I was doing more full body movement and really acting more like a consultant for people and an advisor. And that's how the coach piece came there. And that's really what people need, is some support in understanding that pelvic health is a lifestyle and understanding all the different facets of it that will also support what they do with a physio.
Yes, I love that. And I think that's super needed, because I work with a lot of moms. I'm not a mom myself, at least not yet, but sometimes I will ask women that I'm working with, and maybe their last kid was 5-10 years ago. And I'm like, well, let's flash back, because they'll be complaining about that area of their belly that never ever gets smaller, no matter how much weight they lose, or lack of core strength in certain exercises. And I'll be like, well, let's think back to, did you ever do any pelvic floor therapy after you had kids? Because if someone had kids 5-10 years ago, I'm usually younger than them. And I feel like I see a lot of pelvic floor PTs now, but is that because usually that people just aren't aware, or they aren't given that information postpartum, or where is that disconnect, I guess?
It's all of those things. And I think so back from when I started in 2009, the awareness has increased significantly in thanks to social media, all the different social media channels that we have. Amazing. There's not just our course, there's other certification courses out there. So the word is getting out, and the conversation is now not as taboo. Media outlets are now talking about it. So and sometimes I think, I've been talking about this stuff for so many years, everybody's heard it by now. And I'm still shocked that people are like, I've never heard of this before, and no one's ever told me. And so we still have a ways to go in normalizing the conversation. I always say that I think that we need the same PR that dentists have. So, we have been conditioned from a young age to brush our teeth and floss and see a dentist once or twice a year. And we go, even if we have no symptoms, because they are the people who are experts in our mouths and they screen for challenges. And I think we should impart that same knowledge to the younger generation when we're starting to talk about childbirth and sexual education and body health and menstruation. If we could talk about the superpowers of the female pelvis and pelvic floor and all of the reasons why we need to be, vigilant with exercise and practitioners such as pelvic health physios when we become sexually active, if that seed was planted earlier on, I think it would really change the landscape for women's health. And so there's more and more birth professionals, doulas, midwives, childbirth educators who are talking about pelvic floor as well. However, what I still see is that the pregnant person they don't have a problem to fix per se. And so the motivation to do the work preventively, to start doing pelvic floor exercise, to see a physio, they're kind of like, well, I don't know if I really need it. And it's the people who then have problems after. It doesn't even have to be, you don't have to have given birth to experience pelvic floor challenges, but once people have an existing problem, then now we're motivated to find a solution. So I think there's part of it is there has historically been lack of information and awareness. There's also, I still feel a bit of a lack of, I don't really need it. Nothing's happening to me right now. And then it's the second and third time moms who are coming back saying, I really should have paid attention that first time.
Yeah, I bet. And let's talk about some of those common problems that people see. Like, one I definitely want to talk about is incontinence. And when I was back in my CrossFit days several years ago now, like I said, I've never had kids, and I would sometimes pee during like double unders or jump rope, things like that. And there was a video that had gone viral at that time of a woman who was doing Olympic weightlifting, and she caught a squat clean, and you could see her pee like on the podium or on the lifting platform in the video. And people were like, that's no big deal. It's just because you're lifting heavy. Like, it's not a problem. And I'm like, I feel like this is a problem that even I need to address.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't taught at the beginning of my fitness journey, not until I became a personal trainer and moved away from CrossFit was I actually taught proper core stability, which is a huge bummer. And that's not the same as everyone's start of their fitness journey. But can you talk about, I guess, that as being one main problem that a lot of women deal with and how to help improve that or fix it?
Mm-hmm. There was another video. I don't know if it was around the same time or not. I don't know your timing, but there was another video that was put out. I don't want to throw anybody under the bus. I can't remember who published it, but it was essentially a video of a CrossFit competition. And there was an interviewer, and he was walking around interviewing people and, saying, hey, I see that you're wiping something up off the floor. And they would say, yeah, I leaked a little. And, so they were all kind of laughing it off. And they said, well, that's just what it takes to be the fittest woman in the world. There was even an OB-GYN. I think it was an OB-GYN. It was a doctor, but I can't remember exactly her qualifications, but she was there saying, yep, this happens. I think it's completely normal. And everybody, all of us in the pelvic floor world who were watching this video were just cringing. And unfortunately what happened is CrossFit took a hit, and they had a really bad rap as a result. And while CrossFit is, a lot of the movements are fantastic. I love the camaraderie of it. I think there's so many benefits of CrossFit. The intensity at which it is often encouraged is maybe not right for everybody. It's not taking into consideration that male and female anatomy is fundamentally different. Women go through menstrual cycles. Many of these women have given birth. There's been changes to the pelvic landscape that aren't screened for, aren't talked about. And then when we have videos like that, it just, the people that are dealing with it are like, oh, well, I guess that just happens to everybody. And then we have media who says light bladder leakage is just part of being a woman, and Poise commercials have younger and younger women in there. And so again, we're just, oh, well, I guess that's what happens. Sometimes even healthcare providers will say, well, you're approaching menopause now, or what do you expect after giving birth? And these are like direct quotes that people have heard from their care providers. So you're right to say incontinence, when urine leaks out of your body, when you do not want it to, which typically you only want it to if you're sitting on a toilet, that's incontinence. And shouldn't be happening. This shouldn't be happening. And so it's a signal your body is sending saying I can't manage this load. I can't manage this. I can't do this. I need some help here. And so often not, we just put the pad in as the Band-Aid and keep going. And it's not something that gets better. It will typically get worse. And so I always say light bladder leakage is not just part of being a woman. It's very treatable. There's a Cochrane collaboration in 2010 summed up that 80% cure rate with pelvic floor physiotherapy and exercise. And so I really want women to know that it's not something that they need to deal with. Pads are not something that they need to accept as their destiny. And if it's happening during an activity, running, so double unders are that's a big one. Also box jumps are a big one, but jumping on a trampoline, running, especially longer distances, those are all times where people notice leaking as well. And so we can look at that and say, all right, your body's sending you a signal. So what can we do? We could stop running. Yep. But a lot of runners especially are not going to stop running. Same with CrossFitters, right? So how could we change that exercise to make it so that you're not leaking? Is it the intensity? Is it the pace at which you're running? Is it the length of your run? Is it your cadence? Is it the frequency, how many times per week you go? So we can play around with some variables to see if that helps. But we also want to pair that with pelvic floor physiotherapy, physical therapy, if you're in the United States. Same profession, just slightly different named. And working with the pelvic floor physio to optimize the response of the pelvic floor for whatever task it is that you want to do without leaking is the best approach. Ignoring it is not going to solve the problem and could potentially lead you to have a bigger hill to climb later on.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, this was for me personally, I was like in my young 20s and there were moms working out with me. And I remember them being like, it just gets worse. I was like, this just doesn't seem right. And it's interesting now talking to you and thinking back on those days, because now it's been, 7 years that I'm talking about in the past. My CrossFit days led to a low back injury, what I thought was a low back injury. But just over the past year or so, I was kind of struggling with it on and off. And I really doubled down on core stability work, not necessarily specific pelvic floor work, but really core stability. And I haven't had issues in such a long time as far as pain goes. And definitely after I decreased the intensity when I left CrossFit, which was years ago, never had those peeing while doing jump rope issues either. Yes. So it really is all connected, right?
Absolutely. And there's a physiotherapist, a doctor of physical therapy in Canada who did a study, and the results of the study, I believe that the percentage was 95.3. I could be slightly off in there, but high 90s percentage wise of women in the study who had low back pain. They present with low back pain. 95.3, I believe it was, percent of them also had some form of pelvic floor dysfunction. So the low back is so closely tied to the pelvis. And how many people in the world do you know that have had low back pain at some point in their life? And have they ever considered the pelvis? Not very many of them have. They've seen chiro, massage, acupuncture, which all can play a role. And I love complementary approaches, and that could potentially resolve a problem for some people. But when you have tried all the things and it's not resolving and it's kind of this naggy thing, pelvic floor physio is often the missing link. And back to the comment you said about the women who were like, oh, it just gets older. And we need to have some laughing moments. We need to have some way of coping with it. Nobody wants to do it. The unfortunate part is so many of them are, they sort of laugh it off and accept it. And I only wish all of them knew. And some people do know, and some people still choose not to get treatment, and that's their choice. Right. But I want everybody to be informed, and then they can make the best choice for their body.
Yep, definitely. Definitely. And so you mentioned Kegels earlier. Speaking specifically about exercises, those are ones that I feel like everybody knows, but like you said, nobody really does. Mm-hmm. Should everyone be doing those? Are there other pelvic floor exercises that quote unquote everyone should be doing, or what are a couple things you might recommend?
Yes. Kegels are a form of pelvic floor exercise. I do believe that we as vagina owners would benefit from having some sort of pelvic floor fitness routine in our life. The challenge is right now, Kegels are really the only thing that we know about. So just like we've had this, we've tried to get the word of pelvic floor physio out more. That's happening now. The interpretation is still that, oh, well, we see them and all I'll be coming home with is a bunch of Kegel exercises to do. That might be a piece of what you come home with. There's the Kegel exercise gets a little bit of a bad rap as well too. So it was Dr. Arnold Kegel. He saw women having challenges after giving birth with contracting and relaxing their pelvic floor. He used a biofeedback device called a perineometer to help his patients. And that's how the Kegel exercise was born. And then what's happened over the years is, like, you've been in fitness and you've seen, CrossFit is a perfect example of let's go as hard as we possibly can. The interpretation of Kegels is we have to squeeze, like we have to think of lifting up pianos and doing the most intense contraction we've ever done before. And oftentimes the fundamental execution of it is wrong because no one's taught you how to do it. And that's not people's fault. We've often been told, and lots of people have heard, go home and do your Kegels, but nobody's really had their pelvic floor evaluated to see if they're doing it correctly. So we have even research to show that the majority of people are doing Kegels incorrectly, and therefore thinking that they either don't work or potentially seeing an exacerbation of symptoms or an onset of new symptoms that are arising because of a strategy that's not necessarily optimal. So usually when you see a pelvic floor physio, one element will be having them help you determine if you are contracting and relaxing your pelvic floor correctly, and potentially going home and practicing that a little bit in coordination with your breath. Some people will layer it into movement. That's my philosophy. But there's different ways to execute that exercise, different cues, different imagery. Maybe some people need to focus more on the relaxation portion of that exercise. Maybe some people need to focus more on the lift or the squeeze. And so when you have an understanding of what your pelvic floor needs, then you can work on that element with specific types of movements or specific types of cueing or imagery or what have you. And my philosophy, as I mentioned, is to, once you have connected with your pelvic floor, understand its relationship with your breath, you then layer it into movements like squats or bridges or bicep curls or push-ups, whatever you can think of really. And in doing that, by contracting the pelvic floor just before you exert a movement, so push up or stand up from a squat or lift your butt off the floor in a bridge, when you pre-contract your pelvic floor just before the exertion portion of a movement, you are reminding the pelvic floor that it should be pre-contracting. So it should be working without us thinking about it, but lots of things disrupt that messaging. So we're reminding the pelvic floor, remember, contract, please. Now I'm going to exert my force. And then now we're going to relax. You do that a number of weeks and it starts to become automated again. And then you can start to increase the intensity or the load or the speed or whatever it is that you want to do. But you need to train the pelvic floor to respond dynamically. Just doing Kegels at every red light or while you stand and brush your teeth is sure better than nothing. We have some research to support that a Kegel practice done in sitting, lying, and standing 2 times a day can be effective. But if we really want it to be resilient and variable to all the things that we do in life, let's train it with some more intense movement and explosive type movement so that we can run or jump or do all the things that we want with it responding appropriately. And so a movement practice, a whole body movement, and emphasis on the glutes for sure, focus on the breath. And then I do advise maybe just say 1 set of 10, maybe 2 sets of 10 of Kegels on their own done either sitting, lying, or standing, sure, every day, but let's say 3 to 4 times a week. And that just really helps that motor patterning that we need as part of the process. Kind of always, especially as we get older and all the influences that can change the pelvic floor and its function, just a gentle reminder, okay, we're going to contract and lift, and now we're going to let go with our breath.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you for that awesome explanation. And that is one thing that I do, especially for me and issues that I've had in the past, like before squatting and deadlifting. Those are times where I really, get set up with the barbell, engage my core, engage my glutes, engage my pelvic floor, and then begin lifting. And it has helped a lot. And that's an area that those 2 lifts in particular, I have seen women struggle with, because I don't know if it's like the Instagram posing or what, but this like need to stick your butt out so that it looks really good while you're doing the exercises, but that loses all the engagement. And that loses especially your lower abdominal muscles and your pelvic floor. Yeah. So if anyone is feeling like I never see glute gains, or I can't lift stronger because there's pain here or there, it might simply be like remembering to tuck your pelvis a little bit under you and really have that strong inner core pelvic floor setup before you lift.
Yep. Yeah. And that could, so we have, yes, even some research to support that in a posterior tilt, there will be a little bit more activation of the pelvic floor. That being said, there are some people who have maybe habitually been in that position, and they might have some tension there, and they would benefit from some relaxation or some release work first prior to doing another exercise that would allow the muscles to kind of let go so that they can respond to that load. So I think that the thing that I have learned over the years that I've been doing this is, at the beginning, we thought it was kind of prescriptive. Well, if you have diastasis, you can't do this. And if you have this, you can't do that. But here's a couple of exercises that you still can do. So it's very restrictive. And it never felt right that we shouldn't be able to do all these other things. But that's kind of what we went with the research and the knowledge that we had at the time. And now what has evolved is there is more research. There have been more people challenging the norm. And it's now, I don't think research is ever going to say, oh, if you have prolapse, you can't lift X number of pounds, or if you've had babies, you can't do this, or you should only do this. I don't think that's ever going to happen. Thankfully, I think that won't happen. But we all are recognizing also that it's so individual. There are people that could have the exact same pelvic floor dysfunction. They could both have incontinence. They could both have a bladder prolapse, same stage of bladder prolapse. They both had 2 kids. They're about the same weight and height. All these other variables are fundamentally the same. And they may have completely different symptoms, completely different challenges, completely different execution styles. So we can't, that's the challenge. And yes, I have group fitness programs that are supposed to be tailored for the general population. And there are many people who have results from that. There still will be some people that don't, because there always will be certain individual factors that we can't address for. And that's the benefit of working individually with a physio or a personal trainer who specializes in pelvic health.
Yeah, thank you for calling that out, because that is important to remember. There's hardly ever a one size fits all, whether it's nutrition, fitness, pelvic floor health included. So yeah, really, really good reminder. And you mentioned diastasis recti there, which is another thing I wanted to ask you about. And maybe this is related to women who have had kids who feel like they can lose all this weight, they can get shredded upper body and lower body, let's say, but they still have a belly area that looks maybe a little bit bloated or distended sometimes. Are these things related? Are those other issues that you see commonly? And are there some somewhat applicable solutions that you could share?
So when I first started, again, it was really pelvic floor driven. And then when we formed Bellies Inc., what we were recognizing was there was this missing link between the pelvic floor and the abdominal wall. And we sort of were saying, we're all connected. And our real target was to help with the abdominal wall postpartum, but indirectly approach it through the pelvic floor. And so diastasis was our main topic of conversation, I guess. And that's what we were, and a lot of what's in our certification course, a big portion of the assessment is learning how to assess for diastasis. So diastasis recti, diastases, DRA, these are all things that you may have heard or seen written up. And the internet had a bit of a frenzy with diastasis and created a bit of a a bit of hysteria around it. A lot of people were, I've been diagnosed with diastasis and I can't do all these things. And it put a lot of fear in people. And we also look back and say, we played a role in that because we were also, again, at the time, we didn't have a lot of research and it was very restrictive movement and this will make it worse. And this, and you look back now, we cringe and we apologize to a lot of people that we held in such tight parameters. But so diastasis is the term. Diastasis recti means separation of the rectus muscles. So the two six-pack muscles, the misleading part of that definition is there's always a gap between the two rectus. They are never fused together. There is always a space. They're joined and kind of held in place at the midline by the linea alba, which is connective tissue. And there's never in, all the research that's out there, there's never really been a determinant as to what is a normal interrecti distance, what should that gap size be? So when people say, close the gap, or, I've closed my diastasis, it's not the most accurate term. We never really close it. There always has been, always will be a gap there. And the other challenge is a lot of people aren't learning about diastasis until after they've given birth. And they never had known about it or even measured before. So when they're measuring now, they can't really compare because we don't know what you were before. Maybe you were the same that you are now, and we just don't know that. So there's lots of misleading information all about closing this and closing that. And we now have more research to support that. It's initially, most research was done on the size of that gap and can we reduce it? That was the outcome we were all looking for, thinking that would solve everybody's problems. But the connective tissue wasn't considered in that. And a lot of people who maybe the interrecti distance was narrowing, their connective tissue wasn't gaining integrity. And that was meaning that the size of the gap didn't mean anything. It was more their capacity to generate tension in that connective tissue for core control. So we now have more research to support the need to address the connective tissue. The pelvic floor is a piece of that. So when we perform a pelvic floor contraction, there is a co-contraction of our deep abdominals. Also, when we do glute work, that tensions the thoracolumbar fascia, which can create some of the integrity and tension in that midline that we want to transfer loads in movement. So we can assess for, within the scope of a trainer, we can assess using our fingers. That's not really super reliable because we all have different finger sizes and,
right.
But we also have to factor in diet, stress, hydration, all sorts of other things can influence that connective tissue. If we have food sensitivities and we are dealing with bloating, that can create some inhibition. That means that we may always look more distended or may not be able to use our inner core unit properly. If we are dehydrated, that can also lead to, dry tissue, so to speak, that may not respond as resiliently as we want it to. Poor sleep, we have motor control challenges, all sorts of things can influence it. So we know now that the gap is not the biggest deal. It's not totally irrelevant, but we need to consider that along with the integrity of the connective tissue. And there's a lot of different factors that come into play in terms of healing it, which could be posture, could be breath, could be pelvic floor. Initially it was don't do crunches, don't do planks, don't do twists, don't, it's that whole big don't do this list. And that thankfully is much freer now. And it's, again, back to the individual and what symptoms they have. Do they have any pelvic floor challenges? So we would be choosing movements to load the abdominal wall that also like ensuring that they weren't creating additional challenge for the pelvic floor. So we want to make sure that if we were putting somebody in, say, a lean back, that, if they're sitting on the floor and we were having them lean back as far as they could and then hold it there, can they manage that pressure, intra-abdominal pressure, such that it's not creating descent of the organs or leaking or anything like that? But what we're recognizing now is we took the load away. We took the load away from the abdominal wall and everything was just like, okay, just do some pelvic floor contractions and roll to the side and push yourself up. And that was kind of it. And now we kind of, the pendulum went completely the other way. And I think we'll nestle somewhere in the middle, which is kind of where we're coming to now, where there's going to be any exercise is on the table. It's more about how you do that exercise and how does that feel in your body that day, that the next day. And is it supporting your goals? And is it creating any worsening of anything or improving? And oftentimes when we can regain the integrity of that connective tissue, regardless of the distance between the rectus, symptoms of incontinence and prolapse can also start to improve as well, because we have more, rigidity is not the right word, but more integrity in that core to be able to manage those pressures.
Okay. So definitely something that's important for anyone who thinks they might be struggling with that, if they want to keep lifting and work through athletic goals, fitness goals, or even physique goals. Like, definitely something you don't want to just be like, well, I don't know if I have this.
Yeah. And a lot of people, I mean, there's a lot of self-tests. A lot of people now know that term. Again, there still are people that have no idea. I've never heard of it before. But if you are struggling with a tummy that won't flatten, there's lots of different, I have one on my YouTube channel that walks you through how to do a self-assessment, to assess for the distance, but also to assess for your connective tissue integrity. But there also used to be, and this is just starting to change in the last kind of year-ish, maybe, where people would have a diastasis and we were starting to put them into other different movements. And then we would see this presentation like a cone shape along the midline, kind of looked like a loaf of bread. And so people would do certain exercises and we would see that doming and we would say, stop, halt, that's too much pressure. You're not managing it well. So we can't do that exercise. And there's a few people now who are saying, is it a bad thing? Is it maybe just an adaptation that we have? And is it really that bad? So we're still a little bit on the fence there, but there's a couple of people, Claire Mack on Instagram is one who has a very prominent Poochie tummy, the classic diastasis that won't resolve no matter what she does. And she's going through very intense activity that in the past would have been completely off the table. And it's interesting to see how she is improving in what we would have historically thought, well, there's no way she could do that exercise because she just can't manage the load. And we're looking at her now going, well, the body figures shit out. Yeah. Right. And so maybe we just have to get on with it and stop being so restrictive in our movement.
Yeah, it's kind of like walking that fine line. You got to know when, and hopefully with a specialist, like when you can really push harder, when it's like, okay, I do need to pull back. My body does need some extra healing time, some extra just love and rest right now, or scaling back of something. So
yeah. And the CrossFit world, like I said, I like a lot of the movements. I like the camaraderie. It keeps people engaged. There's a lot of really good things about it. And not just CrossFit, but any of the really high intensity, tough mudder runs, all of those types of things. I just wonder if should we as females be working to that extent? And I don't want to say that women can't do hard things. We absolutely can, but we need to pay attention to all the physiological things that we go through and honor our menstrual cycle, honor the fact that we give birth, make sure we go through pelvic floor training and that it's part of our ongoing care if we are going to be participating in those things. I think they're presented sometimes in ways that, everybody can do this, and they can. I don't want to say that we can't, but with female anatomy, we need to respect that we are females, that we are fundamentally different. And I'll just leave it at that.
No, I think that is really important. I mean, it's been years since I used to be HIIT addicted, any kind of HIIT. And it's been years since I have done any type of HIIT workout. Now, maybe a Peloton once in a while, and that's about it. But it's funny that you say that, because I also work a lot with the spiritual side of things and bringing in that mind, body, soul connection. And a lot of women that I think are called to work with me have that overachieving perfectionist history. And that does certainly bleed into nutrition and fitness. And usually those are the same people, myself included in my history, that were really into those high intensity, because it was like, I am achieving so much in this maybe short amount of time, or even in an hour-long class that you're doing high intensity work. And while it's definitely needed, we require extra recovery when we're doing that. But it's important, I think, too, to call out that women and men receive stress differently. we manage stress differently. Those responses from our hormones are very different in our bodies. And just like you're saying, that recovery of even your pelvic floor, how your menstrual cycle is affecting you. There are so many facets going on that it's so helpful to zoom out a little bit and be like, is this even serving me? Like, what is even my motivation behind some of these workouts? And are they actually taking me where I want to go? Or is my ego leading the way? Right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think long-term, because I think, as I've transitioned, I still work with pregnant women, but most of the people that I work with are kind of perimenopause, around the age of menopause, I would say. And especially during that, like the 40s and 50s, there was so much hormone transition happening. And we typically, the majority of women will be pregnant and give birth at some point in their lives. So they are raising children, they are working full time. They are often dealing with aging parents. There's all these additional stressors in our life, plus the fact that we are going through our own hormonal fluctuations. That is a stressor in and of itself. And then we layer on intense activity that we're probably already dealing with cortisol management issues and hormone imbalance. So then it's an exacerbation of that. So while we're doing it with the intention of helping reduce stress or helping lose the weight that that we've gained or whatever it is, the opposite is often what we need. And so I work really hard to help, and also to add in there, sometimes there's a self-removal from those activities because of the leaking, because of the prolapse, or because they don't want to make it worse. But there's also some people that are just kind of brushing it aside and carrying on and going forward. But sometimes when we can, as you say, kind of pull back and stop, not even stop, but just slow down and have more rest. We still need the intensity. I still like the HIIT, but in much shorter durations, less frequently, and almost more of an emphasis on the yoga, the relaxation, the meditation, the walking. We underestimate the benefits of all of those. We don't think, if we're not sweating and if we're not out of breath, it must not be doing anything for our fitness.
Right. Yes. And that takes a lot of work to kind of reprogram that.
Yeah.
And remember that like resting can be the most helpful thing you can do, not only for your mental sanity, like we were just talking about, but for your body too. Because your body is going to feel less inflamed then. You're going to, sometimes, gosh, in my HIIT days, I was starving all the time and I had to eat a lot. And nowadays it's like my hunger is very manageable. I don't have crazy cravings anymore because I'm not getting the blood sugar swings that would follow the cortisol swings and so on. So it really is, it can make you feel better on the inside and the outside, as cheesy as that sounds. And that's another, you mentioned perimenopause. That was another question I had for you is, are there things that women should know about how our vaginas and or pelvic floors kind of change in those different phases of our life, like pregnancy, perimenopause, menopause, or maybe postpartum specifically? Are there any that kind of stand out to you?
Yeah. Obviously, postpartum, we have, especially if you've given birth vaginally, there, even if you've had no externally visible tearing, there has been disruption to tissue on the inside and all sorts of changes to the landscape. The majority of people have some degree of displacement of the organs, organ prolapse. So we need to honor that time for recovery. Another challenge that's very common is vaginal dryness. So due to the declines in estrogen following giving birth, regardless of whether you give birth vaginally or cesarean, that's another piece to address. And people who give birth via cesarean think, well, my pelvic floor is fine because I didn't give birth vaginally. But there's been the same adaptations throughout pregnancy, the same hormonal influences, the same changes to posture. There's been now residual scar tissue left in the abdominal wall, which we've just talked about, the connective tissue and diastasis and the pelvic floor being part of it. It's all connected. So they need pelvic floor therapy just as much as somebody who's given birth vaginally. And then as we age, well, let me just go back to pregnancy and birth. If people experience incontinence in their pregnancy, if they take action and start working on their pelvic floor and they get it under control, it's significantly less likely that they will experience incontinence on an ongoing basis. People who experience incontinence during their pregnancy who don't address it, it's the likelihood of them having it 5, 10, X number of years later is significantly higher. And so again, getting the information out and helping pregnant women and people take it to heart and actually do something about it is really, really key from a preventive perspective. And then we have motherhood, where we have the distraction of our children. And now it becomes this list of all these other things and people that we need to care for. And we usually are put down to the bottom of the list. So that's very common in with moms to not have their own form of self-care, and pelvic floor exercise and pelvic floor physio is part of our self-care that we benefit from. And when the pelvic floor is working, everything else is a lot easier, including motherhood. So when we can not be dealing with distractions of incontinence, or especially prolapse, that one's it really affects our mental health. When we don't have those to worry about, everything else we have to do is still there, but it's easier to manage when we're not dealing with the chronic challenge on our own bodies. Then we transition into perimenopause. And in today's world, women are giving birth later in life. And sometimes they may be postpartum and in perimenopause at the same time. So perimenopause being the 6 to 10 years prior to menopause being one day that marks 12 consecutive months without a period. Anything after that is postmenopause. So perimenopause years is often met with a lot of hormonal fluctuation, a lot of maybe irregular periods. A lot of people talk about very heavy periods. There's a lot of thyroid issues that show up during that time as well, which can influence our menstrual cycles and our hormones. It's all a chicken and the egg. Who knows which ones come first, but they're all interrelated for sure. And something that comes along with hormone disruption could be a lack of libido. Incontinence could be exacerbated. Vaginal dryness could be an issue. And when we don't have the right exercise or aren't seeing the right practitioners, and we have fluctuating estrogen levels, if the estrogen levels are lower, that could increase the likelihood of vaginal dryness. A lot of people deal with estrogen dominance, and that doesn't always mean that you have too much estrogen. It just means the ratio of estrogen and progesterone is off. So you still could have technically low estrogen. So there's all sorts of, and I'm not an expert in the hormone. I definitely recommend that you work with somebody who is a NAMS practitioner, NAMS, or who is a functional medicine or naturopathic physician specializing in that. And then, once as we get closer to menopause and reach it, we now are no longer producing estrogen. And so our pelvis, which loves estrogen, lots of parts of our body love estrogen: brains, bones, heart, skin, vaginas, bladder. They all love estrogen, and now we don't have it circulating like we did before. And that can lead to the tissues, especially in the walls of the vagina, can become dry and brittle. The walls can actually narrow. Incontinence is much more likely. Irritation and dryness, painful sex is very common. And that's 80% of the statistic is 80% of women will deal with vaginal dryness in the menopause years. And that's not something that gets better with time. Hot flashes typically start to resolve. Brain fog will usually resolve. Other symptoms we have might, but vaginal dryness is something that will linger and does not improve. So we really benefit from addressing that. I'm a huge fan of moisturizing your vagina like we do our face. Hyaluronic acid is something that we have in a lot of our facial serums, and our vaginas benefit from it as well. The one I like the best is hyaluronic acid and vitamin E. There's a website, moisturizeyourvagina.com. I'm not tied financially to them, but it's the product that I recommend the most. It's very clean and it works really, really well. And we can start that now. We don't have to wait for an issue to be there. We can start now. There's benefit to doing it now. And then once we are getting closer to menopause, we can start the conversation with our healthcare provider about local vaginal estrogen. So knowing all the benefits, there's a great book called The Estrogen Fix that I highly recommend every person read. And it really debunks the fears that are associated with with estrogen, and points out all of the reasons why supplementing with estrogen could really improve our quality of life and our brain health and our bone health and our heart health and our vaginal health and all those things. So we have those changes. We also have the fact that if we haven't been consistent with pelvic floor exercise along the way, then like any other muscle group in our body, we may become deconditioned. And maybe that's midlife. It's very common for a time that incontinence symptoms or prolapse or low back pain start to show up for the first time, but it also is maybe the time where it starts to show up on a greater scale because we've ignored it for the years leading up to. So all those reasons that, yes, there's lots of transition that happens within our pelvic floor.
Yeah. And I think sometimes when it's all mushed together like that, like how I asked you, it can sound like a lot, but we can't forget that being a woman is freaking awesome. And our bodies are pretty magical, that we can go through all of these transitions.
1,000%.
And they don't have to be so scary. Like I have dealt with a lot of hormone issues over the past year or so with competing in bodybuilding and getting for my body too lean. And sometimes it's usually simple fixes a lot of the time. So sometimes we get scared that like, oh my God, I'm going to have to do all these things, or I'm going to have to take these meds. But usually that's just kind of fear from Western medicine that's, I don't know, held over our heads or conditioned in us. But sometimes it can be really simple things like we were just talking about, like stress can play a huge role in hormone health over your life, how you move every day, how you connect with your body, especially with proper muscle engagement with pelvic floor and everything else. So while I think, partly while you were talking, I was like, oh my God, so many things to look forward to as I'm almost turned 30. But at the same time, it's, if we shift that perspective, it can be just like a really cool thing for us to get more in touch with our body.
Yes, 1,000%. And I wholeheartedly believe, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, is to plant the seed when the younger generation, so the people that we're teaching who are younger, our kids, maybe plant the seed then how awesome we are and the superpowers that we have, and present it in a way that is not doom and gloom about, well, you're going to bleed for X number of years and then you're going to go through menopause. And then, it's presented in this way that is like, oh, and there's so much suffering associated with it. So yesterday was World Menopause Day, which is a time to celebrate. And I think it's really cool that we now have a day to celebrate this. And the general theme, well, the overall theme this year was bones, but the general comments from people celebrating it were that this is a time that is flipping awesome. And we have to find those things. And yes, instead of rhyming off all these symptoms that are happening, do something about it. And if we are educated and informed and proactive, kind of like how I hope that in the future, it's just a norm that pregnant women prepare their pelvic floor for birth.
Yes.
I hope it's also the norm that we have this information from a young age. And we know that in our 30s and 40s, we will be starting to get into that hormone transition, but we can be supported in that with proper nutrition, hydration, sleep, hormone balance, and working with these amazing healthcare providers, staying on top of our pelvic floor fitness. And while it sounds high maintenance, it's more high maintenance to deal with a health issue. And there's the famous saying, I don't even know who the first original creator of the quote was, but if we don't make time for our wellness, we'll be forced to make time for our illness. And
that is such a good one.
Yeah. And so yes, I'm high maintenance. I do lots of different things for my pelvic floor and for my overall body health, but I am not okay with suffering. It's not an option for me. And so I will invest the time now so that I don't have to invest the time in taking multiple drugs per se, or, being limited in activities or whatever it is. That's way more high maintenance to me.
Yes. Hell yeah. I love that. What a powerful note to end on. Perfect. I feel like I learned so much, and I know our listeners did too. And I just want to encourage everyone listening to embrace this as an opportunity to learn more about your body, to focus on your wellness routine in maybe a different way in the near future if a lot of these things that you brought up struck a chord. But thank you so much for being here. I feel like I have a million more questions now. So where can everyone go to learn more, to connect with you? I think you said you have some group coaching and personal coaching options.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I really enjoyed speaking with you, and thank you for an opportunity and a platform to share the message. My website is vaginacoach.com. Essentially, if you go to Google and put Vagina Coach in, you'll find me on YouTube and Pinterest and Instagram and Facebook. I have a private Facebook group called Box Talk, which is a safe place for people to come and ask questions and connect with others and learn. My latest book, called Your Pelvic Floor, launched in March of 2020, and it is available on Amazon. And that's a really good, I don't mean to say that because I wrote it. I just mean it was meant to be kind of like a handbook, and it's applicable for any age. So purchase a copy and then give it to a friend and have them pay it forward and send it to somebody else too. So it's information that I want everyone to have in their kind of their healthcare toolbox. And yeah, my programs are online, self-directed. I have a 28-day challenge called the Buff Muff Challenge that a lot of people start with.
Such great names for things. I just got to say, I saw that on your website and I'm like, who doesn't want a buff muff? I love
it. Yeah, I think we all want a buff muff. So that's usually where people start. And then the people who want a little bit more one-on-one attention, then I do offer individual coaching as well.
Awesome. Those are some great resources. So thank you for sharing those. I will link them all in the show notes if you're listening. So check those out and find Kim on all of her platforms. And thank you again, Kim. Thank you for being here. This was such an amazing, insightful episode.
Awesome. You're welcome. And thank you very much.
Bye, guys. Do you feel energized and refreshed now? I hope this episode gave you a little boost to get out there and start manifesting your fittest, healthiest life. If you loved it, please help me out by writing a review and sharing this episode to your story. And seriously, just thank you so much for being here. For daily updates of what I've got going on and to connect further, be sure to follow me on Instagram and head over to ccowellness.com to learn more about my one-on-one coaching and find additional resources there, including my Goddess's Guide to Macros ebook, plus a few freebies. And remember, you are strong, you are capable of achieving anything you desire, and you are worthy of all your wildest dreams.